What price, say you, hath dignity when gilt and velvet crowd the floor? Who would sell a farmer's name for the shine of a jeweled ring, or trade a man's quiet days for the applause of those who measure worth by coin? Beneath a tent of oiled linen and perfume there came a sound not bought nor sold, a slow hoof, a breath like wind through dead barley, and with it a question that hung, bright and terrible above their polished cups. Whose horse is that? Smoke of torches, the sweet rot of spilled wine, the hush of pursed lips. The auctioneer's voice climbs like a bell, and on the dais a beast stands like an accusation, flanks carved by storms, one eye like a moon scarred by winter, a poor man, with soil still under his nails and a coat that had seen more seasons than the Duke's tapestry, stands in the doorway all marrow and stubbornness. He clutches a small dented bell at his breast, a thing none here would notice save for the horse that tilts its head and, for a long suspended heartbeat, remembers. What follows when a memory looks up from a creature's eye and finds the man whose name it knew? The question cracks the polite air, and no man in that glittering room is ready for the answer. He was called Jonah by the few who had cause to call him by any name, but the fields had given him many other titles. Hand-withered morning keeper, breadless in drought. He kept no book, save a tally carved on the inside of his gatepost and no coin that did not smell of the soil. His cottage squatted at the crook of a lane that forgot the city, its roof a comb of muted straw. There he rose when the light broke, worked when the clouds opened, and came home when crows themselves drew curtains across the sky. Jonah's wound was not sung. It sat under his ribs like a slow stone. A year and a half before, winter had taken the only brother who could o'erride a seed and had left Jonah with a debt that matched his despair. The lender's note had a face and eyes of its own. The lender's son, who wore gold like a second skin, took interest in the man's land. Jonah bartered the last of his good hay for the name of his field in the town ledger, and kept one small thing for himself, a hollow against the cold, a dented bell, tied with a frayed red string. He would wake sometimes and feel the bell against his ribs as if a promise had weight. He tended other lives as well, a brood of hay-worn hens, a cellar of apples like sleeping moons, and for reasons he never spoke aloud, a memory of a chestnut foal he had bound with straw and soot, to keep from being lost to a ditch. The memory was a lamp under glass. He could not use it for warmth, yet he could not bear to break it. Sometimes, standing at his gate with the bell at his hand, he would imagine the animal prancing through the rye, mane lifted like a banner, and feel a joy like a bruise. Word came down the lane like a rumor of heat. The Duke's estate was selling. The house must be made lean, the stables cleared as if the very pride had to be made ready for its next gilding. Fine beasts, the town whispered, and rarities once hauled from beyond the sea. An auction would be held beneath great awnings where the wealthy would speak in softened vowels and the poor would not be welcome. Yet an ember of something, memory or madness, coiled in Jonah's breast. He fetched his coat, that thin shield against the curious cold, and tucked the bell close. He did not expect welcome. He expected the look that the city gives a weed, curiosity sharpened into the blade of mockery. He expected the auctioneer's laugh like a coin dropped on cold stone, but there are calls one cannot deny. To stand in a room where a creature whom one once held by the halter is raised like a chalice, and not to lift a hand, is to let a part of one's life be sold under the foot of scorn. Jonah went to the sale because the bell at his chest told him to go. A little thing, but stubborn as a root, they gathered under the white, dukes and their daughters in sleeves full as sails, merchants who traded in horses and secrets, a clerk with eyes like a ledger, and on the raised platform arrayed like trophies, beasts whose coats shone as if they had been polished by the very winds. The tent smelled of candle wax and perfume. The chatter was a river of small knives. When Jonah entered, hands brushed his back as if he were a ghost about to be swept from a tapestry. A child laughed at his boots. A woman whose gloves were thin as leaves smiled with teeth too precise. Jonah did not call himself to account. He stood at the periphery, a man who kept his face like a closed gate. The auctioneer lifted his ledger, voice as sweet and sharp as a new scythe. Names were called like blessings. Cages and carriages traded hands. When they passed the finer stock, men applauded as if applause could mend any wrong. So much of a man's honor is seen when he is unwelcome. Jonah felt the room as a kiln where he had been set to test, and there, upon the central dais, stood a chestnut horse, the color of late harvest, with a scar across its flank like the curve of a broken promise. Its mane was braided with a single tattered ribbon, the dye long bled away. Its eyes held the stoic silence of those who have been broken, and yet remember where they were born. No jewel hung at its throat, only a frayed strap, and at that strap, as if to mock the man's poverty, there twined a small silver medallion, dented, and bearing a worn image of a dove. The sight of that medallion was a small, fierce lightning in Jonah's chest. He had seen that very coin once, not new, not polished, but struck with a dove for a child given a bell the day they bound the foal. He had mended that medallion in his kitchen with a file and a thread of copper, because its loop was loose. He had left the medallion upon his own hearth for a night and then placed it back under his milk bucket, where the light could never find it. That such a thing lay on the horse's strap, and now upon a creature who held itself like a memory, stilled something inside him. He glanced to his hand and felt the bell there, warm and small. He did not tell why his fingers trembled. He only remembered a name the world had not spoken, Morning Star. He had called the colt that once in a voice stolen from the dawn. They said that great beasts carry the dignity of their keepers. They do, until they are separated from it. Jonah had felt the loss of a beast as one feels the loss of a limb. He could move, but the world was altered. The auctioneer's tone rose and the bidding began, voices weaving like vines, each more eager to claim such glory. The house clapped at each increase. The price ballooned until Jonah could see no number that would yield his breath. He could step forward. He could ask. He could ring the bell. He did none of these things at first. Shame is a weight that sits between the ribs and cannot be thrown off with gestures. Yet the bell at his hand clicked against his thumb, small and clear like a promise knocking at a door. He stepped forward as one drawn by the tide, and when he did, the tent seemed to tilt. Eyes turned. Conversation bled into silence. The first sound Jonah made was the clink of metal. The bell he had kept against his breast, now brought out by fingers that smelled of furrows. He could have thrown it away like a triviality. Instead, he lifted it to his lips and let its cold kiss remind him of shape and name. The little bell chimed in the hush like a voice from his attic years. The horse's ears, honed as a farmer's own, flicked. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Amusement first, then a shading into something sharp. The auctioneer, a man of fine angles and finer manners, arched a brow. A young lord near the front smirked and made ready his purse as if to add insult to price. Jonah walked, not as one who intrudes, but like one who comes home to find the house occupied by strangers. He kept his mouth shut and held his bell. The horse's nostrils flared. It inhaled the smell of hay and earth, cleaving to the scent of someone who stood half a world away. "Back, sir," an usher hissed, thinking to shepherd Jonah away as one would a wandering cur. Fingers rough with velvet touched his shoulder. Jonah let the touch be brief. He said nothing. He had always been a man who did his pleading with work, not words. The bell chimed again, and with that the beast lowered its head, a slow, reverent incline as if memory were a curve worn into bone. A woman in pearls leaned forward and spat a question that had no curiosity, and much disdain. What would a poor plowman do with such a horse? Come to buy pride on borrowed coin. Laughter, a brittle thing, chimed. Jonah did not meet her glance. He remembered a time when laughter had meant only the jests of lads, not the chopping off of a man's breath. He stepped until his shadow touched the horse's shadow, and then he spoke as quietly as the wind under the eaves. Morning Star. The name slipped like a key into a lock. The horse's cheek creased as if a lost map had been unfolded and the place remembered. It made a sound, neither a whinny nor a neigh, but a low, long exhale that trembled the air. Heads turned. A woman pressed her hand to her throat. The auctioneer's voice stopped in mid-syllable. The ledger lay like a sleeping thing upon the stand, and something, an unease like rain on hot earth, began to spread. "Who is he?" demanded a man whose hat was brimmed flat and whose breath smelled of ledgers. "A country soul making a spectacle." "A spectacle indeed," murmured the merchant who dealt in bloodlines and in the hush of pedigrees. "He will but be turned away." Jonah's heart beat in his mouth like a trapped bird. Memory is cunning. It arranges itself in small proofs. He could have called on the past as if it were a law. He had no papers. What paper lay in a man's pocket could be bought or forged. But when he reached, he did not touch the horse. He only held the bell up and let it ring once, twice, the clear, thin sound of metal remembering its maker. The animal's ears pricked forward. It stepped a hair toward Jonah and then quivered. A steward moved to fence him, but before the hand could close, the horse lifted a foreleg and, with a twist that silenced breath, shook a band from its mane. It was a ribbon, blue once, now the color of rain, and it fell like a secret onto Jonah's boot. The crowd inhaled as if the tent itself had taken a single breath. The ribbon lay at Jonah's feet and told a story he had kept folded in his chest. Once, on a market morning lost to his memory, a child had tied that very ribbon around the foal's mane, and the creature had carried it like a standard. The child had laughed with a voice that was Jonah's memory. The child had not lived to age to wear gloves or knuckles of learned trade. He bent and took the ribbon without saying a word. The blue thread felt like a pulse. A rich man shouted, calling for order. The auctioneer, who had tasted scandal in his day and smelled the pennies that rode on astonishment, raised his hand to steady the tide. "Ladies, gentlemen, a foolish peasant with sentiment. Move him aside." The crowd leaned, hungry for the next display of money. Jonah felt the hand upon his shoulder again, firmer this time, and for an instant his whole life was in the balance of their fingers. Yet the horse, as if given a name like a summons, stepped forward until its muzzle touched Jonah's side. It breathed upon him, and in that breath carried hay and river, and more than that, the memory of a hand. The animal nudged his chest lightly, as one friend does to wake another who has slept too long. The press leaned in, and somewhere in the throng a child forgot to chirp. "You see?" cried one of the lords, both amused and affronted. "It knows him. Tricks of animals. Good for a laugh at the tavern." Coins clinked like a verdict. But a man who makes a living on horses, who knows that beasts keep more than muscle, that they keep the trail of a childhood, saw in that nudge the break of a vow. Horses remember scent and voice and the weight of hands upon them as men remember warfare and a mother's face. The steward who had been about to draw Jonah off found his hand still. His jaw worked. The bidding continued, but it was now a different game. It was not only price that swam between the tables. It was the question of ownership of memory. A rival bidder, Sir Almeric, whose name carried with it hunts and highways, put his hand up and added handsomely to the purse, eyes alight with hunger for scandal and sport. The room warmed. Money rose as if lifted by a fever. Jonah had no coin. His coin was a bell and a ribbon and a memory. He had faith. As the price grew, so did a new peril. A man in a velvet waistcoat who ran the Duke's stables stepped forward and said in a voice that smelled of starch, "This beast is bound for the Duke's private line. Its papers are signed. No man may halt a sale that has been ordained." His hand lifted to the saddle where a pack sat. If the pack were opened, if the ledger within showed another name, if law favored coin, then memory might be drowned by ink. Jonah felt the room tilt. He thought of his brother's debt like a lever, lifting the weight that pressed his chest. He thought of the bell at his breast, of that small silver medallion dangling at the beast's strap. He had one token that might slant the scales, and yet tokens speak only to those who listen. The steward moved to pull Jonah back. A knot of men in silks came close, eyes narrow and hungry. "Stand aside," cried the auctioneer, voice gilded with command. "This is a lawful sale. Keep to thy corners, ye who have no purse." The crowd began its chorus again. The hammer trembled like a fist about to fall. Jonah did not argue. He did not shout. He stepped forward as if a path had been laid by the horse's own shudder. He put his hand upon the animal's neck, a farmer's touch, firm and honest, a laying of claim not by title but by tending. The horse leaned into the palm, warm and heavy. The tent inhaled. A woman let go of her laugh like a net. The auctioneer looked ready to call for guards. Then, as if some small fate had been waiting in the pouch at the saddle, the strap slipped and a thin roll of paper, dark at the edges, uncoiled and slid to the ground like a fallen leaf. Men bent to snatch it up. A clerk thrust a finger to keep it from the floor. The auctioneer's gloved hand closed. A hush like oil fell over the throng. Jonah saw the paper and, though he had been a man who trusted soil more than ink, knew the seal by shape and scar. There, pressed into wax and no longer whole, was the imprint of a hand that had once held his father's. He took a breath that tasted of iron. He reached. The steward, with a duty to those with purses and a disdain for those with dirt, blocked him. "No," he said flatly. "Thou art not titled to touch estate papers." The horse stamped, vexed, and in that movement it tore the medallion from the strap. The little dove lay in the dust between thumb and glove. A child in the crowd who had come to see something bright and leave with a tail shrieked as if struck. Jonah's hand moved and, by habit older than fear, he retrieved the medallion and the ribbon and the parchment with fingers that had known seed and ledger alike. The paper split. The wax cracked with a sound like old wood signing under rain. Jonah bent his head and read but one line before the auctioneer's fist came down on the ledger like a judge's gavel. "Withdrawn," cried the auctioneer, voice snapped to steel. "The sale is bound by the Duke's writ. No man intrudes upon that which is lawfully known." The steward stepped forward and a cluster of men closed in. Jonah stood with the medallion and the paper limp in his hand. The horse stamped and snorted, nostrils flaring like flint. All at once the room had fallen to a hush that tasted of storm. Men whispered, collars high. Some said the paper was nothing. Others peered like conspirators. The nobleman's hand that had sheltered the ledger now hid a smirk of triumph. Jonah felt a finger in the small of his back that was colder than any hand he had felt since frost. Took his brother, and then the horse and the creature whose life had been traded, like a coat, and did a thing that no man expected. It planted its front hoof upon the fallen paper, and with a gentle, deliberate push, it tore the page along a crease Jonah recognized as the fold of a deed. The action was small, yet in it lay intent like a blade. The horse pushed until the paper parted, and there, in the split, a line of writing showed like a scar in the page. A name. Not the Duke's, Jonah's. Silence was an animal that stalked then. The steward's hand hung in the air like a question. The auctioneer's mouth formed words that clattered and could not make sound. The men in velvet and lace drew back as if the room itself had swallowed its breath. Jonah's fingers closed on the medallion, and the bell at his breast chimed once more. The animal's ears relaxed, and it stood as if struck by recognition. The paper in Jonah's hand was proof or play, but proof, when read correctly, can change the direction of a life. "Read it," someone whispered. Then louder, "Read it, man. Read what is writ." Jonah felt the crowd press at his back like a tide. He had no law book in his pocket. He had no learned tongue to twist and turn the script to suit him. He held the page with hands that trembled and an eye that could see the scratch of ink as if it were a furrow. He read aloud, though his voice at first was as thin as a crack in winter ice. The words were simple and old. Property transferred in name of Jonah of Moorfield. The room answered with a sound like a breaking. A hand clamped his shoulder. A steward hissed, "Begone! Thou art a thief of tales." The auctioneer raised his voice to drown out the stir, but his voice faltered. The ledger, the papers, the wax seal, all the trappings of lawful exchange, had been cleft by a man with a bell and a horse with a memory. Men's faces changed like weather. In the corner, Sir Almeric's mouth had gone thin. The noble woman in pearls paled. The house that had sold the Duke's goods found itself undone by a single torn page and a dented medallion. Jonah felt the pressure of 1,000 eyes, some hungry for scandal, some for vengeance, some for truth. The steward stepped between him and the dais, and the horse, still leaning, whickered as if to speak. The auctioneer cleared his throat and called for order with a voice that tried to be thunder and landed as a pebble. "This is but sentiment mixed with the mud of rumor. Papers can be older than truth," he said, but the sound of his protest was thin. Jonah felt a heat rise in him that was not anger but a long-damned sorrow pressing a door. He had come to the sale with nothing but a bell and an old name. And now the auction house, for all its gilding, had been forced to meet a sliver of what it had tried to bury. The crowd leaned in, breath stalled upon breath. The steward looked to the Duke's man for a sign. The Duke's man glanced to the auctioneer, who could find no footing. Then, as if fate had been waiting with a quill poised, the auctioneer stepped forward, not to yield, but to brandish a new threat, a summons, men-at-arms, law, an accusation that the man before them would be removed. The tense flap rustled like a flag at command. Jonah felt eyes like knives. The horse planted its hoof and stamped. The sound was the drumbeat before a storm. When the great canvas door was thrown open and 2 men in livery advanced, the tent seemed to tilt as if at the hinge of a long truth. Jonah held the medallion and the torn edge of the paper like a man with the last winter's coal. He could be pushed aside. He could be hauled away. Or something older and truer might be proved. He raised his head. The bell at his chest hung like a small moon. The horse breathed, and from its nostrils came the scent of rain en route. Jonah's voice, now steadier, woven with the courage of plow and pluck, issued not quite a plea, not quite a claim. Let the paper be read. Let the law see its face. A murmur swelled to a clamor. Hands reached for ledger and for lance. The steward's fingers bunched into a fist. The auctioneer opened his ledger and looked for the column where men's names are weighed, and found himself a poor man before a greater poor man with a paper. The horse shifted, and in that shift a small sound escaped, like a neigh that asked not for coin but for justice. The tent flapped. Outside, thunder muttered like an old god, and then the auctioneer, slashing his hand for silence, lifted his quill and, with a tone that tried to be both damning and decisive, cried, "We will not be hurried by peasant tricks, guards." Before the guards could seize him, before the bell could fall from Jonah's fingers, the horse bent its long neck and placed its head upon Jonah's shoulder, as if to shield him from the hands that would pull him away. The gesture was intimate and insolent both. It made the room hold its breath. In that held breath there came a sound from the crowd that split the air, the sharp, incredulous gasp of a woman who stepped forward and, with eyes that knew more than they had yet said, let fall a single line that would change the measure of all men present. "This paper," she said, voice small as if not to frighten the truth, "is not a tale of whim. It is the Duke's own register. Where did thou find it?" Jonah looked at the horse, at the ribbon at his boots, at the medallion warm in his palm, and then at the gathered faces, at the purses that had thought to buy history and the hands that had thought to sell it. Outside the tent the sky broke and rain came, first as fingers and then as a sheet. The auction house seemed to shiver. He could answer with silence. He could answer with a lie and be taken away. But the bell at his breast chimed once more, and with that tremor he opened his mouth and named in a voice that the tent had not heard, the place where a man's truth is born. At the edge of the Duke's wood, under a broken fence, a mare lay with her foal, and she had upon her neck this medallion. I took the colt in and fed it. I named it Morning Star. A hush deeper than before fell. Men looked as if the very floor might tilt. The auctioneer's face went slack. The steward's hand fell from its clenched position. Sir Almeric's jaw set as if steel were cooling. The woman in pearls pressed a hand to her mouth. Then, in a voice that had the faintness of an ember seeing fuel, the Duke's steward, the man who had declared the sale, said, "That is a tale for the law. If true, there are papers unaccounted for." Jonah felt the noose of their disbelief tighten, yet in his grip the medallion warmed like a hope. The horse pressed again, and from beneath its mane came a sound, a soft wicker that carried a name and a claim and the force of a memory. Morning Star. The crowd leaned. The storm banged at the tent like a mallet. The guards closed their palms on reins. And then, at the very moment when a hand reached for Jonah's shoulder to pull him away, and when the auctioneer lifted his hammer as if to silence the world, a child in the front row, who had watched the whole play with the candor of those who keep no purse, pointed and cried out, "Look, a brand." All eyes turned to the horse's flank where, hidden under bridle and hair, a crescent mark showed, the mark of Jonah's father, burned into the hide of the foal years ago. The crescent was a thin white scar, curving like a moon over the beast's hide. It was the same mark the man had carved into his gatepost, the same mark he had traced with his thumb when the nights were long and company scarce. The tent held 1 second longer, and then the auctioneer fell silent as if the sea had closed his mouth. Jonah stood with the medallion in the torn edge of the paper. The crowd waited, and thunder beat a slow, expectant rhythm. Outside, the rain struck harder, as if the heavens themselves asked what would be done. The tent's breath held, as if the world drank in a single moment and could not find a place to let it out. Rain rattled the canvas like 1,000 tiny feet. The lamps guttered, throwing faces into relief as if all were carved from the same surprised wood. Jonah stood with the torn edge of the roll in one hand, the dented medallion warm in the other, and the horse, a Morning Star, laid its long head upon his shoulder as though to lend him weight against the tide. Guards moved then, their bridles of authority rattling a little sooner than the law would ask. One stepped forward, boots making soft stamps upon the dirt, and spoke the language of men accustomed to owning space. "By warrant of the Duke, this property is to be seized and sold. Our duty is plain." His hand was steady. His eyes were not. Jonah's reply was not a speech but a faultless thing. a look that set the bell at his breast to ringing like a heartbeat. He did not shout. He called no friend. He only set the torn deed before the auctioneer and, steady as a plow's furrow, read aloud the lines the paper kept hiding in its crease. The words fell like stones, simple, heavy, and impossible to turn aside. A transfer. Names a signature not made by coin but by oath. This paper, he said, was sealed in the hand of the Duke's own steward. It names me Jonah of Moorfield as the lawful keeper of the mare and her foal. A ripple of something like wind ran through the crowd. The auctioneer's face, so practiced in gloss and command, lost the steady sheen men had admired. A clerk with eyes small as knots in wood reached for his ledger. Fingers that had moved with the comfort of habit now fumbled. The steward who had shouted law a breath ago felt, perhaps for the first time that day, the cold of uncertainty. Sir Almeric, who had come with purse at the ready and contempt as a cloak, stepped forward with all the swagger of a man who thinks the world is bought by his laughter. A man with mud upon his boots claims a deed. Where is thy proof of signature? Where is thy witness? We will not be fooled by folk tales. He did not know, as many who wear rich things do not, that proof is not only ink and seal, it is smell and scar, touch and brand. Morningstar shifted and the crowd saw under bridle and hair the pale crescent burned into the flank, the mark Jonah had traced into his gatepost on long sleepless nights. The crescent was not a flourish of coin but a brand of belonging, carried into flesh where paper can only envy. An old man at the back, a shepherd who had watched Jonah sow lines into the field for 10 years, rose. Cane in trembling hand and in a voice like dry straw declared what he had seen. That brand was marked by Jonah's father. I helped him hold the beast. I signed no parchment. I signed with the season. I tell what I know. Another voice followed, a third. Small witnesses multiplied like seeds in a furrow. The steward, who had once wearied the room with the certainty of protocol, tried to call for the law. He flourished a paper and bellowed of writs and warrants. But law itself was a thing that needed proof to flourish. The torn deed on Jonah's palm, the medallion with its dove, dented as any family trinket would be after storms, the ribbon that had fallen at Jonah's boot, and the brand upon Morningstar's flank began to sing the same tune. They were not alone. Memory gathered like cousins about a hearth. Sir Almeric would not yield to memory. He lunged, words sharp as knives, accusing Jonah of theft, of deceit, of daring to claim what he had not earned. Hands went for the man. The horse, startled, reared, a balanced act of fear and grace. And in the scramble, Sir Almeric's foot caught in a crease of canvas. He stumbled, and momentum made him clutch at a chair. The fall was not cruel, but it was enough. A man who wished to buy a story with coin lay marred by the very place he had thought to place his pride. The crowd gasped. Laughter died hard. A hush that tasted of thunder fell again, then broke when the Duke himself, wrapped in a mantle of late authority, swept into the tent with the manner of a man accustomed to being the last word. He looked about like a man entering his own portrait and found, instead of the expected array of trophies, the bending figure of a farmer steady as barley. The Duke's eyes, clouded with that patience bred by power, rested upon Jonah. For an instant all men were students at the same lesson. "Why?" asked the Duke, voice measured as the cut of coin. "Do you bring scandal to my sale, man? What claim lay you before my house?" He was old enough to have seen more than one truth and not young enough to mistake show for substance. Jonah could have knelt. He could have owned shame. He could have begged. But Jonah's words, when they came, were neither plaint nor plea. They were the language of those who have watched seed sprout under drought, plain, quiet, unadorned. "I found a mare and her foal at the Duke's wood, your grace. I fed the foal. I named it Morningstar. The papers you hold were signed long ago. I hold but this." He lifted the torn page, the medallion. The horse rested his muzzle against Jonah's throat like a benediction. Man close to the Duke, the steward who had presided over the stables and now over the auction, tried to turn the page of authority into a shield. He spoke of ledger and writ, of shelf upon shelf of entries, and yet his voice lacked the iron of certainty. The clerk with the small eyes, whose trade had been to track beasts and bonds, took the torn page and with a surgeon's patience fit it to the ledger's margins like two halves of a shell. Ink that had seemed proud and unreadable now lined up and showed a truth, an omission, a line where a name had been struck and another inked in haste. The clerk's hand trembled. "Who altered this?" demanded the Duke, and the question landed like a spear. Accusation arcs in a room where men have much to lose. The steward's face paled. Almeric's jaw worked. Men shuffled their feet as if the tent might tilt from its pinning. At that moment, Morningstar did a thing that the room would tell for years. He lifted his head, turned slowly and with a deliberate motion that was neither trained nor contrived. He stepped forward and placed his nose against the Duke's boot. There was an old quiet in that gesture. The Duke's hand, unused in such intimacies, dropped for the bridle as though in a dream. A small slip of leather fell from the Duke's cloak when he reached, a fragment of a parcel that bore a scratch of paper beneath its seam. A name, the same scrawl that matched the ink on Jonah's torn deed. Silence dropped into the tent like a sheet. The steward, whose shoulders had been squared in duty, slumped. He had been the man who had kept the papers, and yet he had not kept all. The Duke examined the scrap and held it up like an accusing mirror. His voice, which had been the cut of govern, went soft at the edges when he read aloud the word written there. Moorfield. A dozen small truths gathered and, like birds sensing weather, rose together. The shepherd who had spoken before now pressed forward, and he was not alone. A woman with hands that had once stitched a collar under Jonah's roof, the same woman who had mended the medallion's loop on a chill night, stepped, clear and declared in a voice that made the auctioneer swallow his practiced polish. The steward took upon himself to keep what he thought fit. He altered a line so the Duke's house might profit. I saw it. I mended the medallion and I saw the man take a deed. He said it was for safekeeping. Accusation, once a single spark, becomes a blaze if fed. The steward's defenses, built of protocol and posture, found cracks. Men who had once depended on his convenience now saw in him the shape of a self-serving fate. The Duke's face hardened to the stone he had been, and yet even stone yields to a crevice of truth. Sir Almeric, furious at the turn, lunged to claim Morningstar by force. He believed a horse to be a jewel that could be whisked away if hands were strong, but the Duke, who had stood by his steward but who had not imagined theft within his own walls, lifted a single hand and called for watch. No man may lay a hand where law has not yet judged. Let the magistrate be called. The Duke's tongue now moved in the direction of justice, and with justice arrived a man with inked hands, the town magistrate, summoned by the Duke's steward in the confusion, and now standing like an impartial scale. Under the magistrate's gaze, witnesses spoke. The torn deed was fitted to the ledger like a patient returning to its place. The medallion was identified by the woman who had mended it, the ribbon by a child who remembered the morning of a fair. The shepherd's memory was noted. The clerk's fitting of the paper became testimony. One by one, the flimsy walls of the steward's story collapsed. The Duke's eyes, which had been warmed by the soft glow of possession, now cooled and narrowed. There comes in some moments a tilt so decisive it breaks a life into what was and what will be. The magistrate, with a voice that carried the finality of scales, declared that the evidence, brand, witnesses, deed, medallion, was enough to halt the sale until proper legal remedy could be pursued. The auctioneer's ledger was closed like a book whose last page had been read aloud. Men who had scoffed now shuffled like actors whose script had been stolen. Sir Almeric, robbed of spectacle and opportunity, spat a curse and, with the dignity of a man wounded in pride, left the tent. The steward, who had misled the house for gain, was removed from his post by the Duke's command and led away under guard, his shoulders bent as if under the weight of his own ledger. The auctioneer smiled, mouth tight, and called for calm, but his smile had lost the currency of command. Morningstar rested his head anew against Jonah's chest. The touch was not grand. It was a settling, a soft seal upon the day the creature had chosen. For Jonah the world seemed to return, as if a field he had once lost had been plowed back into his palms. He had come to the sale to be trampled. He left it not with coin but with something that mattered more, the world's remembering. But triumph, even when clean, can leave a bitter undertow. The steward's treachery had been stout and meant to empty pockets. How many other deeds had he hidden? How many other small men had been made to suffer? The tent emptied with questions as much as it emptied with men. Rain had washed the dust into new tracks. Jonah stood with Morningstar at his side and felt the tent's flap close like an eyelid upon a day of revelation. The climax ended not in roaring applause, but in a quiet that holds the aftertaste of lightning. Jonah's name, once hardly worth the cost of a thin loaf, now rang through the rafters with a sort of simple justice. Yet even as men gathered their cloaks and their pride, the eyes of the Duke regarded Jonah differently, not with contempt but with a new and peculiar curiosity, as if seeing a man whose worth had been measured not by purse but by the stubbornness of truth. When the crowd dispersed, the tents became a map of absence. Men who had come to buy titles left with less than they expected. The Duke ordered the steward's possessions secured, and a clerk, pale with the taste of guilt, was sent to fetch the records that would prove whether other wrongs had been done. Jonah felt, beneath the swell of vindication, a delicate fatigue like a plow left tilted after a long day. He might have expected the Duke to summon him to censure a trespasser. Instead, the man, who had more habit of commanding than listening, approached with a steadiness that avoided dramatics. "Thou didst speak plainly," the Duke said, and there was no mockery upon his tone. "Thy name will be kept from me no longer. Tell me where thy land lies, and I will see that the law does not profit from the misdeeds of my house." Jonah named his croft, that thumbprint of field where seasons had signed him with sweat and soil. He asked not for coin nor for titles. He wanted only the silence of his plow and the right to call the hedge his own. The Duke, with a gesture that felt like the closing of an old book, ordered that the deed be restored to Jonah with immediate effect, and that restitution be made for his humiliation. The steward's ill-gotten gains were to be seized, and the Duke vowed to make good, as far as his coffers and conscience permitted. Word of the day passed through the town and the lanes like a bell's chime. First clear, then carried. Those who had jeered now found their brows cooler. The auctioneer, whose life was tally and stage, asked Jonah whether he would accept some compensation. Jonah's face, that map of furrowed honesty, showed him to be a man of measure rather than malice. He declined any gift beyond the deed's restoration. "Keep thy coin," he said in his plain way. "Save it for those who have lost more than I. Not every hurt can be washed with a tongue of law." Jonah's brother's debt, the old ledger that had eaten his nights, had not yet been settled. But the Duke, moved less by charity than by the clear sight of wrong and the need to mend it, offered to annul the claim upon Jonah's fields in recompense for the steward's manipulated entry. The lender, faced with a raised house and a Duke's command, took coin and withdrew. The debt, which had been a shadow over Jonah's days, unrolled like a field after frost. People came to see Morningstar, some with curiosity and some with the hope of witnessing a miracle. The child who had pointed at the brand was given a handful of berries and a tale to tell. The woman who had mended the medallion was praised in small ways. A new spool of thread, a pot thick with stew, kindnesses that do not erase shame, but begin to sew it closed. The shepherd regained his place in the market. The clerk's honesty was forgiven as if a wound could be cauterized by confession. Jonah took Morningstar away from the molds of public spectacle before the tent could shape legend out of him. He would not have his beast turned into a trophy. He led the horse by a rope that was neither tight nor slack, the gate between man and beast confident in its slow reclamation. People lined the lane as he passed, some with smiles, some with heads bowed, and the bells of village chapels began to strike for the hour, carrying a resonance that matched the small bell Jonah still wore. That night, Jonah returned to his cottage. He put the medallion back upon his hearth, not hidden now, but given a place of light. Morningstar was stabled in a stall that smelled of straw, and the kind of peace that comes not from certainty but from being tended. Jonah hung his coat upon a peg and sat by a window that looked out upon the moon-silvered field. He ran his hand along the gatepost where he had once carved the crescent and felt the groove with a reverence that was almost religious. He did not sing. He merely listened to the night. And in the small hours, when the world is smaller and the mind larger, Jonah allowed himself a thought that had been too wild to name aloud, that memory, when kept honest, will outlive the gilded lies of those who would make history a ledger to pad. He slept as farmers sleep, briefly, deeply, and with a readiness to rise. The season turned as seasons must. Spring cracked through the last of winter's teeth, and fields pushed pipes of green through the softened soil. Morningstar grew in the way an honest thing grows when given steadiness, not flaunted, not hidden, but known. He took to the plow as much as any ox, his shoulders broad and certain, the scar across his flank a white line that caught light like a memory. Children came to see him and learned how to approach a horse with respect, slow hands, quiet speech, and the willingness to let trust be earned. Jonah's croft, small, stubborn, dignified, fed him more than bread. It fed a peace that once had seemed a distant prayer. He repaired his fence using wood he had bought with coin the Duke had returned, and he drove the plow with a steadiness that felt like prayer. The bell he wore never left his chest. It was the measure of a man who had been humbled and risen not by pride but by patient work. The Duke, who had watched the affair not merely to keep a ledger but to keep his name clean, visited once that year. He walked the lane not as a man above but as a visitor to an estate small enough to sit within a handshake. He stood by the gate and looked at Morningstar. Men tend to speak of power as something that melts upon approach of gentleness. The Duke then spoke plainly. "Thou hast kept what honesty demands." And Jonah, who had no taste for titles, answered, "Thy house had some wrongs. Now some have been made right. Life resumes its pattern. It does not forget its storms." Jonah buried no great hatchet, for there had been harm beyond coins and papers. The steward's removal rippled outward. Other shelters of convenience were examined with the light of truth. Those who had profited from the steward's small treacheries returned some modest recompense. The town, stirred in its appetite for spectacle, chose tenderness a few more times than before. On a day when the sun lay soft and the world smelled of cut grass, Jonah led Morningstar to the edge of his field. The animal paused where the furrow met a copse of birch. Jonah took from his pocket the small ribbon, faded, rain-worn, and tied it into the horse's mane once more. It was not a flourish for strangers. It was a knot for memories. He took the little medallion and hung it upon a stake beside the gate as a token and a warning that small things hold great certainties. Morningstar turned his head and, with a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to acknowledge the longness of their travel, he lowered his head. Jonah placed his palm upon the horse's neck and felt the warmth of breath and the slow, steady drum of a heart. The fields lay in quiet promise beyond them. Jonah, who had been humbled in a room of velvet and returned by a life of furrow, lifted his face to the sun and let it shape him anew. He did not seek revenge. He did not desire the Duke's further favor. He sought only to keep his patch of earth, to feed the hens, to keep the bell at his chest and the name, Morningstar, upon his lips. Those things untrumpeted are the small crowns a man may wear that do not rust. At dusk, as light folded like a blanket and the cattle began their slow commute to stall, the horse stepped forward, set his hooves in the soft earth, and then, as if to sign the day with an act that stitched start to finish, nudged the gate that led to the lane. It was a single gesture that said, "I remember where my field lies. I will walk it with thee." Jonah laughed, a small sound like grain tumbling, and took up his bell. He rang it once, long and true. The sound spread thinly through the air and a hush followed. It was an ordinary sound, and in it lay a world of plain pleasures. There was no great trumpet, no triumphant shout, only a bell, a man, a horse, and a field that would bear their days. Jonah's life resumed its steady arc. He tended, and the earth returned her fruit. Neighbors came and went. The debt collectors, those knives of red ledger, found their edges blunted by the Duke's order and the town's new memory. Morningstar sired foals in time, each bearing a crescent that the village came to know as the sign that stories do not end when those with coin would have them stop. They end when truth is tended. When at last Jonah was old and his hair had taken the frost his body once felt on bitter mornings, he would sit by the gate and watch a child run, and he would tell the tale in short pearls: a man, a horse, a bell, a deed. He would not make of it a sermon, only a memory. He would tell them the truth he had learned, that dignity is not the property of velvet nor the coin of the mighty. It is the slow keeping of a promise. And upon the last evening when he would walk the field and know the ground by the telling of his foot, Morningstar, hair silvered at the mane like a moon grown old, walked with him to the gate. The animal lowered his head and placed it once more upon Jonah's shoulder, as he had done in a tent of merchants and men. Jonah closed his eyes and listened to the steady beat of a creature that had shared his fate and whose life had been the mirror of his own. He set his hand upon the brand carved into the post and, in a voice thin with years but rich with weather, he made the one line he would have all things remember. It was a sentence small as seed yet shaped like harvest. The words, when they came, hung in the evening like a bell at the last toll. Here lies the home of a man who kept what was given him and gave back the measure of his days. Morningstar shifted. and the breath moved as if the world had drawn a satisfied sigh. The crescent on the animal's flank shone faintly in the dusk like a promise kept. Jonah's final line, the scrap of poetry that would haunt the lane and the heart of those who heard it, fell soft as dusk and lingered as if it were a bird reluctant to leave the branch. Go thy ways with truth, for it walks truer than any purse. If this tale stirred thy soul, subscribe and press the bell, that thou mayest return anon to hear more of humble hearts and noble beasts. If thy heart was moved, leave a word below, that others may find this tale and know that truth like a good horse carries us home.